ado, I am delighted to introduce Ada Ferrer, who is here to discuss Cuba and American history with us. Hi, Ada.
Thanks for having me, and I've got a copy of the
Perfect.
book
Thank
here.
you. Thank you. So for those of you that don't know, Ada is the Julius Silver Professor of History and Latin America and Caribbean Studies at New York University, where she has taught since 1995. She is also the author of Insurgent Cuba, Race, Nation, and Revolution from 1868 to 1898, winner of the Berkshire Book Prize for the best first book by a woman in any field of history, and Freedom's Mirror, Cuba and Haiti in the Age of Revolution, which won the Frederick Douglass Book Prize from the Gilder Lehrman Center at Yale University, as well as multiple prizes from the American Historical Association. She was born in Cuba, raised in the United States, and she has been traveling to and conducting research on the island since 1990. So welcome. We're very excited about this.
Thanks for having me.
And tonight we also have Jon Lee Anderson joining us. Hello, Jon.
Hi there.
Jon Lee Anderson is a staff writer for the New Yorker magazine. He began his journalistic career in Peru in 1979. He has reported from over 50 countries and covered numerous conflicts in that time. He also writes frequently about Latin America, profiling such figures as Fidel Castro, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, and Hugo Chavez, and then among others. His books include Che Guevara, A Revolutionary Life, The Fall of Baghdad, The Lion's Grave, Dispatches from Afghanistan, and Guerrillas, Journeys in the Insurgent World. So welcome to you both. Ada and Jon will speak for about 25 to 30 minutes, and then we will open it up to any questions that have been submitted through the chat or through the Q&A button. So I'm going to disappear for a minute and let these two talk.
Thank you, Stephanie. And thanks to the Bank Square and Savoy for hosting this event. Just in case Ada had not brought it, I also was going to show mine. And Ada, it's just a monumental work. I've read it cover to cover, and I'm so impressed. It's a great book. It's a hell of a piece of work.
Thank you.
And so
thanks for doing this also.
Not at all. It's fine. I'm happy to. It's a pleasure. And I have so many questions for you. And if you don't mind, there's a couple of paragraphs I just wanted to read out to launch in, and then I have a question for you as a way to start. Near the beginning of your book, you say, the history of Cuba lends itself to monumental and epic tellings. It is a story of violent conquest, invasion and occupation, of conspiracies against slavery, colonialism and dictators, of revolutions attempted, victorious, and undone. And you say that this book is a product of more than 30 years of work and a lifetime of shifting perspectives between the country where I was born and the country where I made my life. It is at once a history I inherited and a history I have fashioned out of many possible ones. It is, in other words, what I have made of my heavy inheritance. And so, I think probably for the readers and for our listeners, viewers, I guess, it would be really interesting to hear you just speak to that heavy inheritance and this shared heritage, even briefly, if you can. I mean, how did this come about? What does that mean?
Well, yeah. So as Stephanie mentioned, I was born in Cuba and I came to the U.S. as a child. My mother had to leave my brother behind in a very painful way that I've written about separately in a New Yorker article that you know. And I grew up among Cuban Americans in a community that was mostly working class, not highly educated, in a community and in a family that was obsessed with Cuba. So I felt like, like a typical immigrant child who sometimes wants to escape their parents' nostalgias and their parents' expectations and so on. But somehow I just became completely caught up in it. I mean, Cuba was everywhere. I couldn't escape it. And I write about this in the prologue. Eventually, I stopped trying to escape it. I kind of just began this personal and intellectual journey to try to understand it. And to me, one of the things, and I think the way I tried to understand it kind of has colored the way I see almost everything in life, you know, as an intellectual, as a historian, as a New Yorker, as everything. And one of the things that most struck me growing up was that the people I grew up with were, you know, struggled day to day to earn a living. That most of them had not even gone to high school. In theory, they would have been the kind of people who the revolution would have been made for in some sense, but yet they rejected it vehemently. And then I left that community and went to an elite college, and there, you know, everyone seemed to embrace it, but they came from a very different background and had all kinds of privileges growing up. So I guess what I was drawn to were things that did not always easily fit a frame. You know, I felt like the childhood and adolescence I lived, the version of Cuba I lived in exile, could not be contained in kind of neat historical categories. Yeah. And so I felt like I inherited both my parents' nostalgia, the pain of family separation, this obsession with this far off land I hadn't yet, or wasn't that far off, but anyway, this foreign country I had, where I was born, couldn't remember, hadn't yet seen. But then also this discomfort that things didn't quite fit. And that's what that's what I became obsessed with and wanted to figure out. And in some ways, that's what I spent my whole kind of adult career trying to do. So that's what I mean by the book being a product of all that, as much as a product of, you know, 30 years of work in Cuban archives.
And so much about writing history is about how you frame it, isn't it? It's everything, isn't it?
Right.
Once you know you have the frame right, I suppose it may be an intuitive understanding for some people. And in your case, it was both intellectual and, I guess, primordial or something. And I feel that it's you know, it's so original for that reason. You know, the subtitle is a little beguiling. It's Cuba and American history, right? You know, and it really is, to a degree that, I mean, as much as I've read about Cuba and also having lived there, there's so much I didn't know. And I wanted to ask you about that. I mean, and this isn't just about the Cuban Revolution. This is about 500 years of Cuban history.
Yeah.
And yet it feels very acute, very urgent, very timely, very contemporaneous. And the way you have narrated it and researched it and narrated it allows us to see this natural progression, or in some cases, maybe an unnatural progression.
Right.
And I wanted to ask you, if you had to define what the key substance was that united these two countries over this sweep of history, what would it be? A commodity or a trade? What was the main glue?
The main glue. You could say it's sugar, you could say it's slavery, you could say it's greed, you could say it's territorial ambition. There's so many things. It's so hard to boil down to one. But actually, I do think that from the very beginning, it is American imperial ambition, maybe. I mean, I may rethink this, but I think that's there throughout. So if you have people like Jefferson, even, you know, at the almost at the moment of independence, saying Cuba, we need Cuba. Cuba is what is missing to fill out, or maybe Adams said that, fill out the measure of our well-being. It was either Jefferson or Adams, I can't quite remember now. You know, and Jefferson apparently had said the ideal map of the US would include the southern boundary of Cuba to the south. So there was this interest there from the beginning, and the source of that interest kept changing. So, in the beginning, it was about territory, it was about expanding and protecting American commerce. Later in the 19th century, it was about protecting slavery and to some extent white supremacy. Later, it was about American investments and American investment in sugar and banking and other industries like that. But in some sense, that American sense that it was up to the US to determine what that relationship would be is a constant. So that's a constant. The relationship is there throughout. It's also uneven throughout. It's never an equal relationship. So I would say that. And that the other things like sugar, slavery, even Cold War containment can come under that umbrella of American empire.
Yeah, it truly is the launching pad for American imperialism. That is to say, or imperial America, if people take objection to the first term. But absolutely true, and may well explain why it remains an object of desire. And there's also the passive aggressiveness built into our policies. I mean, we've made peace with Vietnam, but not with Cuba. Yeah,
exactly.
And that's inexplicable.
Yeah, and that's why even though the Cold War ended and the Soviet Union collapsed, that was, I think that longer, deeper frame is part of what explains the ongoing Cold War between Cuba and the U.S.
You've been a historian of our near beyond, I guess the Russians would call the Caribbean and the American backyard, which is how so many Americans refer to as or think of as Cuba and the Caribbean, it's really the slave crucible of the New World, wasn't it? And this has been one of the main themes in your scholarship for a long time. And one of the things I learned in your book, again, this is one of the areas that I really didn't feel that knowledgeable of, was the degree to which the U.S. Slave trade and slave economy and Cuba's were intertwined. And I just want to, again, if you'll allow me, I just want to read again from a paragraph. And I'm taking liberties with the first line because it comes out of context. Just the illegal transatlantic slave trade to Cuba boomed after 1850 when the trade to Brazil ended, leaving Cuba as the single American market for African captives. In just 10 years, in the 1850s and 1860s, approximately 164,000 enslaved Africans landed in Cuba. Americans were major players in that trade. By then, almost 90% of the slave ships that landed in Cuba were built in the United States. They had American financing, American papers, and American flags to protect them from British inspection and seizure on the high seas. The trade, of course, was illegal, but people, Northerners included, broke the law because the profits could be enormous. In the late 1850s, one Florida senator reported that US ships sailing to Angola could buy Africans for about $70 and then sell them in Cuba for almost $1,200. It's just, it's staggering. It's horrific to read. Yeah. And yet you have centuries of this laid out here. It's really bracing and upsetting history. And I think puts into perspective for Americans to a much greater degree that maybe previously unquantifiable symbiosis that we have with Cuba. It's because it's offshore, because it's never been one of the 51 states, it's never been part of the Union, we've allowed it to be on that shelf, at least that dusty shelf, at least in terms of the old, really ugly history. Not the history of Batista and the 20th century, but that history and how much part we played in it. And if you don't mind, just as a coda to what I read, because again, this was just an extraordinary anecdote in the book, the inauguration of Vice President King in Cuba.
Right.
Can you put it into context for us?
Sure. Yeah.
How did that happen, and why was he there? And
yeah,
how did that
I
link
was
up with
I was
slave
gonna
trade?
refer to that as you were talking, because
Yeah.
it just is such a perfect
Yeah.
example of those entanglements between the US and Cuba, specifically over the question of slavery. So William Rufus King was a newly elected vice president in 1853. The election was 1852. Franklin Pierce won. And King was inaugurated on a sugar plantation in Matanzas, which was a rich sugar country with a good number of American-owned plantations. And so he took his oath of office on the highest peak on the plantation, overlooking these pea green carpets of cane, with people stooped over them, cutting the cane. And it was harvest season, so the chimneys from the mill would have been, spewing their smoke. And the reason he was there is that he contracted tuberculosis late in the campaign, and he was too sick to attend the inauguration in Washington. His doctor recommended something that many 19th century doctors recommended for elite Americans, which was to take the airs in Cuba, to go heal and convalesce in Cuba. They go to not to cities like Havana, but to the countryside, and that was supposed to be curative. And for tuberculosis specifically, people were supposed to go to active sugar mills, and the idea was that breathing those fumes and the heat would kind of, loosen everything up and cure him. So it didn't. He died, but he took the oath of office. Took the oath of office there, and so he himself was a planter and a slave owner from Alabama. So again, showing the connections between these two systems. And that was 1853. That was a moment, Franklin Pierce, his president, their ticket ran on a platform there. People were carrying placards at the inauguration of the president in Washington that said Pierce and Cuba. And the idea was that Pierce would acquire Cuba for the United States. And I think most Americans and most Cubans don't realize how close Cuba came to becoming not one, but several US states. There were filibustering expeditions. There were American presidents tried to purchase the island from Spain. So the assumption was that it would happen. And for a long time, the proponents, the Southern proponents, wanted to do it because they wanted more slave states. So the idea was they annex Cuba. It's 2 slave states, 3 slave states, and that balances out the power of the North, and it protects slavery. So, which also is about the entanglements between slavery and empire as well, right? So it was territorial expansion for the purpose of protecting the institution of slavery. And even before that, if I can just, there's another example from an earlier chapter in the book in the 1820s when I discussed the beginning of the Monroe Doctrine. And there again, Cuban slavery and American investment in Cuba is really important. And you have this really interesting American senator by the last name of DeWolf from Rhode Island, who is also a slave trader. And he continues slave trading even after it becomes illegal. He has about 4 plantations. He and his family about 4 plantations on the island, and he's interested in protecting that property and that wealth. And if you think about it, he invested that money in all kinds of other industries in the US, manufacturing, rum distillery, etc. The plantations for decades sent money back to a local church in Bristol, Rhode Island, a Presbyterian church, every month, $50. I can't remember the exact amount from the island. So you see again these connections between slavery and just American society writ large.
Yeah, so true. I was going to ask you, I mean, I think maybe you've already asked it, but maybe I'll just say it, but so to quite an extraordinary degree, I mean, Cuban history tells us about our own evolution as a society as well, and vice versa. And I think that's one of the things you really encompass well in this book. Those intertwinings between our evolution as a slave society through the Civil War and afterwards. And Cuba was one of the very last countries to officially ban slavery. And so its own relationships between whites and blacks in some ways echoed our own up to the eve of the revolution. There were, as you write about in the book too, cities like Santa Clara, a couple of hours from Havana, where I think in the park, it was the city park was segregated.
Yeah.
There was this emancipatory quality to the revolution that Fidel Castro brought. It was a little out of time in a way, but in a similar, in a way, it was happening at the same time as civil rights in the United States. There was there's a certain. I mean, how would you say that the two civil rights differed from the emancipatory quality of the Cuban Revolution with Black Cubans?
I think I would actually, I know that probably all our viewers want us to get to the revolution, but I think I would take it back further, that the 19th century independence movement against Spain, 1868 to 1898, had massive participation of Black Cubans, of enslaved people, formerly enslaved people. And it also developed a really powerful discourse of racial equality. So there was, I don't think Fidel Castro did not invent that emancipatory vein. That was a really powerful force in Cuban politics from throughout the 20th century. And it's one of the legacies of the independence movement. I think that one of the things, but that's not to say, there was this emancipatory strain early on. It doesn't mean that because it was there, it became a fact, and that there was racial equality in Cuba. And Black Cubans protested all the time against inequality and tried to demand the rights they believed they had earned in the independence movement. So all that was there before Castro came to power. And when
there's so many stories of truncated attempts, the Maceo story and others, the wonderful anomalous story of Los Cobreros.
Yes. Yeah.
The Black Cubans of El Cobre, the mining town that achieved their freedom through a royal decree in 1800.
Yeah.
While slavery continued for another century.
Yeah, till 1886, the second, almost another century. So, and I think when Castro comes to power, there's Black activists who've been very active, writing, mobilizing, and they turn to him and they say the racial inequality and discrimination will not be solved unless you attack it head on. It won't just disappear naturally. And the revolutionary government initially seems to want to deal with it, but it doesn't last very long. They see it as perhaps too divisive in a moment where they need unity because things are getting more complicated with the US, or maybe they just don't care enough to prioritize it, right? Yeah. And so Castro very early in the revolution says, we've solved the problem. Yeah. And once he says that the problem of racism has been solved, it really makes it hard for Black activism to say otherwise, because either they're criticizing the government or they're saying Fidel's a liar. And so the position of Black activists after the revolution becomes really difficult. And it's, and there the comparison with the US is interesting because Fidel Castro invites civil rights, invites, people who are
Black Panthers and others.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Or there's a radio show run by a Black Panther guy that comes out of, I'm just blanking on his name right now, I'm sorry, but he runs a radio show called Radio Free Dixie. And so Castro's always eager to point out racism in the US. But then when those Black activists and intellectuals arrive in Cuba, he tries to limit their connections to Black Cuban activists. Because he doesn't, so there's an interesting contradiction.
to stay with Fidel Castro for those readers who were champing at the bit. The and I see it's already nearly time to go to the questions, but I have two more for you. So this one. So in the sweep of Cuban history, this epic that you've written, that you've researched, this is these 500 years, where does, for you, Cuba's revolution, that is to say, the one led by Castro, 62 years ago,
Yeah.
where does this past 60 years, where does it fit in to this epic sweep of 500 years of history?
It's one of the most important episodes, there's no doubt about it, for several reasons. One, it transformed Cuban society so deeply in terms of property, its position in the world, its alliances in the world, the creation of a very significant diaspora, any number of things. It created change that was, no change is total, but it was significant, deep change. So obviously it's a major one. And I think also because at the root of it, at the heart of it, were these struggles that you can see throughout, a lot of the sweep of Cuban history, right? The struggle of how to overcome or not overcome questions about dependency, right? Whether it's dependency first on Spain or the US or the Soviet Union, how to develop an economy that is prosperous and not only dependent on an export product like sugar or tourism later. So there's things like that. There's questions that in the 20th century are very important about what the balance will be between political rights and what you might call social rights. So, if you go back to like the 1933 revolution and those intellectuals and students and activists, they're pressing for economic rights like agrarian reform and workers' rights and things like that. So but they're linking those, and they're linking those to anti-imperialism, right? So that's a strong strain that Fidel feeds into. But there's also a strong civic strain that's anti-corruption, that's pro-democratic, that wants, un estado de derecho, a constitution that is followed, who want political rights, a free press. That's there as well, right? And so one of the things that happens when the revolution comes to power, the revolution is fed by all those things. All those currents are there before it comes to power, and all those currents are there initially. What happens is that one set of those becomes predominant, right? Things like agrarian reform and things like that, and then fulfilling those ends up leading the government. Well, that's a wrong way to put it. In trying to pursue those, the government and the new government ends up moving dramatically away from the other ones. So again, that struggle and that balance is something that you see it as a theme in 20th century Cuban history. And Fidel Castro and the revolution is very much, a part of that. Of history.
One thing you make, I thought, really clear, eloquently clear was the way in which, in fact, I think you started chapter towards the end explaining that, there was going to be a revolution. There were many revolutions underway, and Fidel emerged. He had the biggest personality. There was also luck. He was an extraordinary tactician and strategist involved, but
other people were killed.
Other people were killed. Many. There was this long-standing battle. You could say that it began back in the 19th century. You do, but finally, and I'll turn it over to some questions. So after this, after this tortured symbiosis between the U.S. and Cuba, how do you feel personally about what the outlook is for the near future now? We're not at a high point, are we?
No. No. I don't know. I'd also be curious to know how you feel, but I'm feeling pretty pessimistic right now. I mean, on both sides, I feel like, Biden had said he would, undo some of Trump's worst policies, the ones that most hurt the Cuban people, and he hasn't done that. And I think that, that hurts everyday Cubans who have less access to things like family remittances and so on, or, and then meanwhile, the Cuban government is also, forget reform, forget negotiation, forget dialogue. It's quashing any prospect of that. And when those protests happened this summer, as you know, like unprecedented, more than 50 places on the island, they responded brutally. And now there's talk of a new protest, a new march on November 15th, and the government seems to be making clear that it'll act accordingly, right? It's saying that it's an illegal march, it can't happen, and I worry, both in terms of what's happening in Cuba internally, and that in the relationship between the two countries, nothing is changing. People are using the same language they've been using for 50 or 62 years, and that language has never worked. It's never produced anything. With the small exception, the small possible exception of Obama, because Obama's policy didn't get a chance to work because it was cut short so quickly. So some people will say it failed. We don't know that it failed. It was cut short before it could have any lasting or any clear impact. So so I'm not feeling too optimistic right now. Losing a little sleep over it, in fact.
Yeah. Gosh, thanks, Ada. Stephanie, you're back.
Yes.
And maybe you can help us with the questions.
Absolutely. We have had a couple come in. And I just wanted to touch on this too. So while I was chatting with Ada and Jon before the event, Ada, you said that there were some changes made after the galley copy was sent out before the final printing. So for those of you that don't know, a lot of times publishers will send out galley copies or advanced reader copies to bookstores and people that do online reviews, things like that, to kind of get people excited about the book. So I am curious. It sounds like, Jon, you have the galley copy, and Ada was saying that there were some changes that were made between that copy that you have and then the final printing. So I'd love to hear a little bit more. And I heard this earlier, but I'd love for you to share with everyone what those changes were and why you felt that they.
Well, that's one of the challenges of doing a book like this that's supposed to go to the present, because the present keeps moving. So there's the present that, the present that was the present when you finish writing is not the present that's the present when the book comes out. And so when I turned in the version that became the galley, it was actually a week after we found out that Biden had won the election. And because Biden had promised to reverse some of those policies, it ended on that kind of note, that perhaps there would be a return to Obama, and then obviously that, a return to kind of well, I should say, to me, it was clear that Biden was not likely to do a full return to Obama's Cuba policy, because the 2020 Democratic platform did not include ending the embargo, which had been in the platform in 2016 and 2012 and so on. So I think, Hillary had campaigned on ending the embargo right after Obama's opening, but Biden never did. But he did say he was going to ease up on the worst of, on the strictest and most rigid of Trump's restrictions. But by the time I was reviewing the page proofs, it was already clear that Biden did not seem to be in a hurry to do that. So basically, I changed it with that in mind, leaving that possibility open. It's basically that. I changed a few other things. I made it a little shorter because it was getting too long. But it was basically that. Just not trying to forecast what Biden was going to do, because it was already clear that the forecasts were not going to be right and that nobody really knew what was happening.
Yeah.
And then, of course, between the time the book went into printing, at which point I could change nothing, and the time it came out, all the protests happened.
Right.
Right. So those are not, those are not in the book. But still, I feel like, you know, that's okay. You can't do everything. And I feel like the epilogue is really about kind of, you know, thinking about Cuban people beyond either government. And I feel like that's also a way to look at those protests. So I think it's okay.
Yeah. It sounds like that still, you know, regardless of what happened over the summer, it sounds like that was still a good place to end. Yeah. All right. We have had a couple of questions come in. So some of them are a little bit long, which is totally fine. That's great. We love a well thought out question. So Elizabeth says, I love the book. Thank you for your scholarship. My question is, how, if at all, did the current or recent political moment impact the book you wrote? Okay, so we did just kind of touch on that. I know your book was decades in the making, but I'm thinking about the Obama years to the Trump years to now. And I'm wondering how the backdrop may or may not have shaped your narrative. I know we did just kind of touch on that, but is there anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, so I feel, you know, I've been working on Cuban history since the late 80s and began traveling to the island in 1990. So I've been doing archival research on Cuba for 30 years, which is a long time. But I haven't, so in some ways, all that 30 years of work is deeply informs this book, right? I couldn't have written it if I hadn't done those 30 years of work. But the actual writing of the book was shorter. So that was more like 5 years. And I began writing it precisely, at the beginning of the Obama opening. So I finished my second book, which was right before this, came out exactly a month before Obama and Raul Castro announced the opening. So I wrote it thinking that because all of a sudden, all these Americans wanted to travel to Cuba. And I felt like there was they needed to know more about Cuba. And there were books out there, but they were more textbooks or they were more academic, or, Hugh Thomas's book is 1,700 pages long. I wanted to write a different kind of history that was more accessible and more readable, and that took this perspective of shifting back and forth between Cuba and the US, right? And I say that, yeah, so in some sense, the Obama opening shaped the book in that way. And originally I was going to end it, end it with the arrival of Obama in Cuba. But that didn't make sense after the fact. We just lost Jon Lee.
Yeah, maybe Jon will join us again in a few minutes. Hopefully we haven't lost him permanently, but okay. Sorry, did you want to continue with that thought, or?
No, I'm done. That's okay. Yeah.
Great. Yeah. All right. So Kathleen has said, moving into the 20th century, how does the author view the Cuban American community in Florida? Is there any softening, particularly among the younger generation, on the issue of lifting the trade embargo and moving forward with, and I can never remember this word,
rapprochement? Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. This is the problem with doing live conversation
right.
Between Cuba and the U.S.
Yeah.
Since Florida is an important swing state, U.S. policy towards Cuba typically, except for Obama, reflects the views of the Floridian Cuba American community.
Right. Yeah, I have Cubans have been traveling and living in the US since the 19th century, but I have a long chapter on the Cuban community in Florida. And, it's a really diverse community. When Obama was opening to Cuba, a good number of Cuban Americans in Miami supported the opening. So it was about half, which is extraordinary in some ways. The Cuban American community more recently came out strongly in favor of Donald Trump, and they voted against, both in 2016, but even more in 2020. So Hillary did much better among Cuban Americans than Biden did by a lot. And what is interesting, that it's not a question of the old guard. The old guard has mostly, many of them have died. The revolution is now, or the revolution came to power 62 years ago. So a lot of people who fled early on are no longer, many of them are no longer alive, no longer voting. Their children are, and some are conservative and some are liberal, and so they're more divided. But what is most interesting is that the largest group of Cuban Americans in South Florida right now are people who came to Cuba after the fall of the Soviet Union. So they are recent arrivals. They're not an old propertied, moneyed guard that people always associate with Cuban exiles. These are recent arrivals. They are products of the Cuban of the Cuban government system. And they came to Florida, and many of them are voting for Trump, and they are among the most conservative and most Republican leaning. So that also is something that I'm not that optimistic about.
Oh, that's really fascinating. And I kind of feel like this next question maybe is a good follow-up. Ed said he would love to ask both of you, how does the memory of pre-revolution Cuba have any influence on the people of Cuba today? It seems to have such a grip on America's view of the island. And I was kind of wondering the same thing. So I think this is a good question. And also welcome back, Jon.
Thanks.
We thought maybe you went to bed.
Yeah.
Aliens landed.
Midnight over in England right now, but
it's such an interesting question. There is so much economic hardship in Cuba right now. And there has been, on and off since the early 90s and the fall of the Soviet Union, right? The recovery from that has never been total for many, many people. And because of that hardship, there is sometimes, even among people in Cuba, this kind of idea that everything was better before. And so this, and so sometimes it's a nostalgia actually for the Soviet period. I got some of that among people my age who grew up in the Soviet period, and there was, there were more things available then. But there's also a, nostalgia for a period where people had, Del Monte raisins as snacks after school, right? I've heard that, so I do think that there is that some of that nostalgia. There is there is a narrative about pre-revolutionary Cuba as a place with severe inequality, with that was where Cuba was kind of the victim always of American imperialism. So that's also a strong current. But I think because there is so much economic dissatisfaction right now, people are more skeptical of that narrative than they ever have been. I don't know, Jon Lee, if that's your sense as well.
Yeah, just remind me of the exact phrasing of the question again. It was
how people in Cuba now feel about Cuba before the revolution.
Again, like you were saying, I think it so much depends on the age of the people.
Right.
And of course, 30% of Cubans are now 30 or under, approximately, I believe.
Yeah,
and
born after the fall of the Soviet Union.
Amongst people sort of 70 and older, that is to say, people who are sentient when the Cuban Revolution occurred, people who are 70, 75 plus, you have a kind of mixed bag of those who were working class or agrarian peasants who benefited or felt that they benefited in the early years of the revolution because they were drawn into schools, they were given educations. This is especially the case with a lot of rural Black Cubans that I've met of a certain age, and their kids in turn have gone on to university. In some cases, they've become middle class, so to speak, although those terms aren't really used still yet in Cuba. But very often their kids, the people who are, say, in their 40s or 30s, don't feel the same way. They don't have the same bond. They don't have the same feeling of belonging or ownership of the revolution. they have that sort of begrudging respect for their elders in some cases. And again, it kind of depends on the class.
Right.
And I think there's a big difference between urban Cubans, that is to say, basically Cubans from Havana, because the rest of the island, they're not really cities, they're small towns and it's countryside. And the people in the rural areas, they tend to be more conservative.
Yeah.
But so you do have a mixed bag because, there's been a lot for the last 30 years. There was the expectation brought about by the end of, the collapse of communism in Europe, and Fidel hunkered down, and people suffered greatly in the special period in the early and mid 90s. Then, there was a kind of liftoff. There's been this waxing and waning of openings, and a lot of Cubans have been able to leave, but many of them have had to leave as God knows what in foreign countries, not exactly the most edifying of experiences in a lot of cases. It's all survival stories. And, and then there was the more recent opening with Obama and Raul, in which there was suddenly a kind of almost an equality in the exchange, almost, I say, in the way people were able to come and go again for the first time and allowed to have passports and so on.
Some people. I mean, that's just it, because that opening only affects some people. And one of the things that I was just thinking about this today, having spent 30 years coming and going to the island, I feel like I've just gone through generations of friendships. You make these friends and then they leave, and then you make new friends and then they leave, and you make new friends and they leave. And there's something, there's just something really sad about it. And then with young people, so many of them just want to leave, right? They have the sense that there's no future there and that they want to leave. That's the kind of predominant feeling when you talk to people in their 20s.
That's right. I mean, we all have stories about Cuban families, and you have it in your own. I was just thinking of a family I know very well in Havana, and I correspond with the widow of a friend of mine. She's, my mother was alive. She would be a little younger, but she's in her 80s. And, for the last few months, things have been really tough.
Yeah.
And this is a woman who's a doctor. Her late husband was a top medical researcher. They lived a kind of what we would describe as a middle-class existence in Havana. And in the last few months, they've been really hard up. They can't get, one of her sons has had to go to Miami to work as a laborer, and he's a professional. He's able to go because there was that luck there. So they had a passport for him, but she's left with his son, her grandson, and there's they can't get basic things. In some cases, basic foodstuffs. In other cases, it's things you and I would go to get the pharmacy, essential items for hygiene or anything. These are problems all Cubans are facing today. It's very difficult. And it's interesting, in my correspondence with her, she will complain in that Cuban way about this stuff, but she is of the revolution. She was an adherent of the revolution. She's never quite broken with it. Yeah. But when the complaining gets a lot, I think, she's about to say something. And just in the last few days, she got a bit of food. The vaccines have started to work in her neighborhood, so she's proud. And the other day, she relayed to me that the government had been able to sell their vaccine to some country. I forget, maybe it was Vietnam, maybe some country has bought the Cuban vaccine. And she relayed this as a source of pride. But you know what? I felt that it went beyond that old revolutionary pride, but it was a national pride. It was, we can still do this. We Cubans did this. Right. And there's a kind of, there's a split. There's something that's unreconciled there. And I think it's that's the way it is. Right. People they veer between one feeling and the other, sometimes in a single day, depending again on their relationship and how many years they gave to that project. Right. Yeah. So it's It's pretty dramatic.
Thank you, John. I feel like that's a really great kind of personal story to end on. I know that there were some questions that we didn't get to, and I'm so sorry if you were one of them, but I feel like this has been a very full and really great conversation. So I am going to wrap it up there. And before we go, I'm just going to pop the link back in the chat for anybody interested in purchasing the book. And just, well, let's see, let me grab this again. So if anybody wants to purchase the book, you can find it there in the chat. Again, I know that Bank Square has plenty of copies in stock. We will be getting more into Savoy, but I know that we sold our last copy last week. But we would be happy to transfer anything over from Bank Square as well if you'd like to pick it up at Savoy. So thank you so much to Ada and Jon Lee for joining us this evening. This has been a really wonderful conversation.
Well, thanks for having us. Thank you,
Yeah.
Stephanie, and thank you, Jon Lee, as always. It'll be nice to see
Thank
you
you.
in person
Thanks for writing the
sometime.
book, Ada.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much,
Thank you,
everybody.
Steph.
Have a great evening.
You too.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye. Thanks.